Efficiency in a market requires that all the potentially most valuable transactions take place. So on the one hand, paying a premium above the reservation wage, if you can call a multi-million-dollar packet a reservation wage, to secure the right managers can indeed be efficient, with the extra pay merely representing a deduction from the extra surpluses that they hopefully would generate. Whether they always achieve that, of course, is another matter. On the other hand, efficiency would be reduced if executives can exert influence on their own remuneration beyond their actual scarcity value, or if boards get the incentive structures wrong, and in particular in the financial sector, that can lead to problems which can contaminate the performance of the wider economy, as we've seen. But even if it's outside the financial sector, if it occurs in enough companies, it can contaminate the community's trust in equity investments and the public company model itself. Well, a window on how well all this is working is what the trends and developments in performance or incentive pay, which include bonuses and equity-based arrangements over various timeframes. These were originally imported to Australia with the crop of United States CEOs in the 1990s, and indeed they have accounted for much of the growth in remuneration since then. They've been favoured by shareholders and boards as a means of aligning motivations of executives with the interests of shareholders themselves, and in particular by requiring executives to have some skin in the game through remuneration linked to equity. But that shift has also increased uncertainty for executives, create a need for what's called a risk premium or a higher headline remuneration. And they've also created some risks for the companies themselves if those incentive packages are not well designed. As they say, incentives will drive behaviour. You've got to make sure that they're the right incentives. So how well has all this worked? The evidence found by the Commission found that the evidence was mixed. On the positive side, the composition of remuneration in terms of performance pay and base pay, those ratios seem broadly okay and to accord with what shareholders say they want. We've not seen some of the more problematic forms of pay in Australia to the extent that they've existed in the US, like reliance on options or non-recourse loans. And at an aggregate level, we've seen a correlation between pay increases or total remuneration increases and overall market returns. But there are some negatives. One is that the performance hurdles on performance pay could be described as relatively permissive in the 1990s, particularly for some firms. Since then, those arrangements have become incredibly complex. We've often heard people say they don't understand them, and some of those people are members of boards. The combination in both those circumstances is likely to have led to bigger payoffs than executives warranted and potentially more for luck than for good performance. And we've also seen some termination payments which are pretty hard to reconcile and would suggest weaknesses in the boards that endorse them. So we found a potential case for intervention, but what kind of intervention in this market would help on balance? The answer, at least our preliminary answer in our draft report that you've seen, is not to impose direct controls on executive remuneration, which we saw as having major risks and costs that could backfire on shareholders and the wider community. It's integral to the public company structure, which has been a major source of wealth creation, that the board has a central role in a whole range of strategic decisions, including executive remuneration. Boards need to ensure that executive remuneration is appropriate, and they need to be accountable, more accountable than they currently are, for doing that job well. So the recommendations for government intervention in the Commission's draft report are about improving the system by improving the market, not bypassing it or undermining it. And we found plenty of scope for such improvement in 15 recommendations directed at enhancing board capability, addressing the perception of the club. Secondly, removing scope for conflicts of interests, how decisions are made and who participates in that decision making. And thirdly, increasing accountability to shareholders through better quality disclosure. There's plenty of disclosure, but nobody can understand it. And by increasing the say on pay that shareholders have. And of course, our two strikes proposal is one that's excited a little bit of controversy in that respect. But we've also argued that those interventions should be calibrated in forms that recognise the diversity of companies and the fact that one size in this area, one size of regulation does not fit all and shouldn't be made to be imposed on all. We're also conscious that the scope for unintended consequences in an area like that is pretty high, and we've been hearing about some alleged unintended consequences from our proposals in hearings that we've been conducting, and we'll consider these in preparing our final report. Well, the second current inquiry, where we're being called upon to advise governments about the right balance in regulation or intervention and in relation to market freedom, is gambling. Now, some of you will know this current inquiry is a reprise of one that we did 10 years ago, which has again been triggered by community concern that the private is out of kilter with the social. In this case, again, some of you may have seen that the Productivity Commission in its draft report recommended a stronger regulatory role in constraining decision-making within the market. We concluded that, unlike executive remuneration, there were significant systemic failures that had led to excessive social costs and needed to be addressed. Now, gambling is enjoyable for many, and the majority of people in this room would have had a flutter at some point, even if only on the Melbourne Cup. But it's a source of significant harms to some so-called problem gamblers and their families. And we've seen a major increase in the social costs of this kind with the liberalisation in particular of poker machines over the years. Now, poker machines have a number of features which are particularly problematic. They involve intensive play, and I'll come back to that. They involve, in many cases, faulty cognitions. People don't properly understand how they operate or what's involved. The prices are obscure. They have conditioning effects, partly through the random payouts that they involve. They're very accessible, highly accessible as a gambling form, probably more accessible in Australia than anywhere in the world. And they're attractive to vulnerable people. Now, the industry would say, but this is only 1 to 2% of the population. But the facts are that 1% or 2% translate to 15 to 30% of those who play these machines regularly, and 40%, more or less, of industry revenue. That last statistic means that in this particular market, it's not possible to rely on self-regulation, and indeed government itself, which gets 10% at the state level of own source revenue on average from gambling, is also conflicted. Hence, while we've seen some progress in harm minimisation, as it's called, harm minimisation interventions over the past decade since the Commission's last report, much of those actions have been ineffectual, characterised, I guess, as clocks and warnings. The rewards from doing this better, from having a more effective intervention, are potentially very great, calculated by the Commission as adding up to billions of dollars in potential welfare. Doing that, however, is not easy. The goal is to target the source of the problem, which is the problem gamblers, without detracting from the enjoyment or the benefits from recreational gamblers, which are also worth large sums of money.